Have you ever wondered why your favorite taco is costing you an arm and a leg these days? Or is your dream couch still in backorder status for months now? Join us as we go behind the scenes of the global supply chain. Let us discuss and understand its complexity and learn from the industry leaders, professionals, and subject matter experts. Expect in-depth analysis and genuine conversations about the major issues affecting the supply chain today. Welcome to Supply Chain Demystified. Your host is none other than the distinguished supply chain expert, Dr. Nick Valles. Professor Valles is the Academic Director of USC Marshall Global Supply Chain Management and Founding Executive Director of USC Marshall Randall R. Kendrick Global Supply Chain Institute.
In 2018, Maersk committed to the Paris Agreement. So zero emissions across our ocean shipping by 2050. Okay. Last year, about 15 months ago, we changed that commitment to be 2040, so 10 years sooner, and we broadened the commitment to be end to end. So we are going to eliminate all the emissions from all of our operations by 2040. So we kind of took a gasp and leaned in when we first set that 2050 goal. And we reached out to all kinds of innovators and so forth and said, help us figure out how to do this. Now we are, again, we've learned a lot in those 4 years. And now we are taking a deep breath again and leaning in to say we can do this in all the different pieces. And so we've drilled down and put goals in place for warehouses. They're all going to be LEED certified or BREEAM certified, that the fork trucks and those kinds of things will be electrified. And all the electricity will be renewable.
So you've
got to set goals for each piece. There's sitting outside the conference right now, there's one of our electric Class 8 trucks, a semi-trailer.
That's correct.
An 18-wheeler that operates on batteries.
Absolutely.
So we've set goals for each of those pieces. As we speak, and this is kind of breaking news, we have a vessel that left Korea about 3 weeks ago, sailing on green methanol rather than the standard fossil fuel. It's biomethanol.
And is it AAA vessels?
No, this is a little feeder.
Okay, feeder
and
vessel.
And it is operating on a fuel no one has ever operated on before. So the supply, we've had to work with the suppliers to get production of this started up so that we had enough fuel to sail this vessel from the shipyards in Korea to Shanghai, where they'll pick up containers. Many of those containers are for some of the U.S. companies that are familiar to you.
Yep.
They then will go to Singapore, fill up again. They'll go through the Suez Canal to Port Said and fill up again. Then they'll go to Rotterdam and discharge a lot of that cargo. And then they'll go to Copenhagen, which is our global headquarters, and they'll have the christening for the vessel where she'll get her formal name. And the president of the European Union is actually going to be the godmother for the vessel. So we are so excited that this vessel is now about a third of the way through all of that voyage. She just bunkered in Singapore.
Well, that's fascinating. So again, I think, and I'm glad that you're breaking the news on this podcast, but I wanted to kind of make sure that everyone understands this point, being carbon neutral by 2040. So when you think about Maersk, and you talk about number of container on each of these vessels, some of this, what we call the large size vessel, can have 18,000 TEUs, 20-foot equivalent. Meaning if we combine those two 20-foot equivalent, those are 40-foot container we often see on the road, right? Which could carry about 20,000 pairs, 25,000 pairs of shoes that we buy, just as an example.
Each of those containers is the size of a city bus.
Exactly.
So an 18,000 or 20,000 TEU vessel would have at max capacity 10,000 city bus-sized containers. But not just stacked above decks. There are also containers down in the hold that you can't see when the ship goes the ship goes by. And some of those vessels are 400 meters long.
That's correct.
That's 4 football fields.
That's exactly right. And so I think to put those things in perspective, that by 2040, 17 years from now, end-to-end, Maersk's commitment would be that those containers will be picked up somewhere at the point of origin. Go back to the example of Korea. Have 3 stops, 4 stops, discharge cargo somewhere, and it will have zero impact. On
Zero carbon footprint.
Carbon footprint impact.
Right. We have to look at all of, and you're right, we have to look at all of the environmental considerations. Carbon is a big concern right now. It's really greenhouse gases that are the big concern because of our growing awareness of the importance of climate change and the urgency to take action. But there are other things we're looking at, the impact on water, the impact on some of the toxic pollutants that come out of our cars and our trucks and the vessels. So we have to look at those things too, but right now I think carbon, what we call carbon, greenhouse gases, have become so urgent that it's something that we tend to think of immediately when we talk about the environment.
So you think, obviously Maersk being a European company, I think there is a greater sense of awareness of environmental issues in Europe, and receptiveness rather, than it is in our parts of the world, because there is a heavy division on these views. And even some of the Asian countries, the growing economies, either they don't have the resources or they still continue to want to grow, and industrial output is more important for them than worrying about other aspects. Do you think we're going to be doing enough to sort of make a major impact for our planet Earth?
I think we have to speed up. I think we all have to work together on this thing and make things happen. For example, we have to have the infrastructure built to be able to produce these green fuels and to deliver them to the ships or to the trucks or to the trains so that we can and actually start measuring how are we doing on all of this. But I'd have to disagree with you a little bit on saying that, we, the U.S., are so far ahead, or Europe are so far ahead and so much more aware than people in Asia or other parts of the world, because I think there's an awareness there too. There are different economic trade-offs, I think, in other parts of the world that may cause them to prioritize things differently. But we have customers all over the world that are demanding that we help them reduce their transportation carbon footprint. And that, I think, is very exciting, too.
Well, that's a great news. That's a music to my ears.
Well, not all of them, but, there are definitely leaders and there are followers. But it's really been exciting to see. And I've been doing this stuff full-time since 1990. So it's really been exciting to see the growing understanding and awareness among C-suite people, because ESG has become a C-suite issue. It really has become a C-suite issue. And not just something that some little department over in this corner does once a year and comes around with a checklist.
That certainly makes sense, and I'm so glad. I think it's a great news for this to be somewhat optimistic views than some of the data pulses that I'm seeing from some of the colleagues in Europe, that they feel that we're not taking as strong of a position back home than they have been able to sort of create consortiums in Europe.
When we're global organizations like yours and mine, we have to define where is back home and where is we.
Yeah.
I think Europe has taken more definitive steps to put regulatory structures in place, but also I think in some thought leadership. But there's a lot of thought leadership and intellectual leadership happening here in the United States too.
I think absolutely. I completely agree with you. So let's transition now to the social.
Okay.
I think this has certainly, let's establish the operational definition. So for the audience, when we say social within the context of ESG, what is that?
Let me jump into that a little bit, because remember we talked about corporate citizenship, and then our awareness of that expanding as we learned more. Diversity and inclusion is one that is clear, but how do you define diversity in a global context? In some places it might be just black, white, male, female, which is not too many places anymore that can just look at that equation. But what about in Thailand? What is diversity there? What is diversity if you're in China? And so that's one of the things that is, I think, increasingly important and yet increasingly complex as we try to do this in a global environment rather than just within the US or Europe, is understand diversity. So diversity is a big one. Labor practices, labor rights, those are all parts of the social piece of this contract with the communities, your right to operate as a company. Your interaction with the community. Most companies have some sort of community support or interaction to understand what's important to that community and to also start addressing it, whether it's sponsoring Little League teams or actually providing financial support to hospitals or ambulances or wastewater treatment plants, those kinds of things. Those are all very local decisions, but you have to have a structure to understand what you're doing as a company.
What I can sort of summarize what you just said is that the social basically means your grassroots efforts to be invested in the local communities and its welfare.
Absolutely, that's a big piece of it. But there's also the taking care of your people, safety, security, the labor rights, the right to collective bargaining. These are all things that are also in that big basket that is considered social. So it's your internal people and taking care of them and bringing in a diverse set of thinkers and people. It's also how you select your suppliers. Are you trying to help build small and medium-sized businesses, which are often more diverse businesses in their leadership? So these are all things that fit into that big basket that is the social piece.
And so I would imagine, like environment, when you say we have a strong framework and it's end-to-end, social, you may have a framework which is just a general guidance, but it will be very tailored to each of the market, because when you talk about the social, it appears to me you have to define that within the context of where your location is and what are the cultural paradigm that you're dealing with.
Right. Well, so it's not a simple, here's what we're going to do, one page, send it out to everybody, and everybody does the same thing, because the needs are different in different places. And yet you have to have similar standards and values as a company that are expressed through those programs.
All right, so we talked about the environment and social. So again, let's sort of finalize our thoughts on the social piece. Is it fair to say there is a major conversation about some of this social injustices, fair practices, child labor, human trafficking? I mean, those are issues they're somehow not visible to the consumer. So I'm buying a product, I am not aware nor made aware of those kind of practices. How do you, as an expert in this field, sort of A, look out for it, and B, suggest that our audience pay attention to those details?
Well, there are actually some reporting systems that have been growing around the world, but they're not really consumer accessible right now. And so somehow we have to, again, give people the information to make good decisions without overwhelming them with data that doesn't help them make decisions. I think on things like basically forced labor, those kinds of things, I think we as a world are still evolving our understanding of how do you find out what's really happening, what is acceptable on a global scale, what is acceptable in given countries with different cultures, and how do you balance all of these things? So these are all very real issues, and we're all trying to figure out how to deal with them. But we have to keep doing these while also doing the environment and also doing the economics, because it's all interlinked.
So true, so true. All right, so we actually spoke about environment, social, obviously, the most important piece, governance, the G within the ESG. Let's define that. How do you articulate the G?
Governance is how does the company management understand whether or not it's actually doing what it committed to do. So do you do in finance, you do audits. In ESG, in some cases, you also do audits to make sure that you're doing something that you've said that you've committed to. But how can a management team sitting in a headquarters someplace actually determine if this plant on the other side of the world is actually following the standards that they've set? And so governance includes things like that, about how do you actually know, what Deming used to say, how do you know?
That's right.
And that question leads to a lot of measures. But if you think about some of the controversies that we've seen in the past about slave labor for garment production that really wrecked certain brands, these are important things for companies to know and understand, partly because it's the right thing to do, but also it can be fatal to your business if you don't get these things right. So it may range from things like responsible procurement, working with your vendors to be sure that they are meeting the standards that you've set. And that's pretty tricky. Do you actually send auditors into their plants in these other countries? A lot of companies actually do that now, to go and check.
So as we talked about environment, social, and governance, right? Of course, Maersk is in the middle of the value chain. But there's a beginning piece from acquisition of raw material, manufacturing, and sub-assemblies and those things before the finished goods are given into a box that you move. How do we ensure that the stakeholders are actually moving the data and proper accountability so that end-to-end systems, from source all the way to the store or farm to the fork, has met all the requirement of ESG?
And that is an area that's getting a lot of focus right now, both from the carbon footprint and climate change perspective, but also from the larger perspective of the safety of the goods, how it's produced, whether it's produced in a safe factory, in a safe manner. So how can you can't have one company try to be responsible for everything. So somehow there has to be a defined system that passes along the information that says this is this heavy, this does or does not contain hazardous goods. This was produced legally. It met all of the requirements.
Certified. Okay.
Certified. There are audits. Companies are actually going into factories and doing audits. For our fuels, we're also doing audits for those biofuels to ensure that they are what we thought we bought. And so that we can then certify to the customer when they paid for a biofuel or a zero carbon shipment, that they actually got that zero carbon shipment. So more and more there is an audit and assurance function that is very important for us to, as a world and as a shipping community, to ensure that all of the pieces are being done correctly.
No, absolutely. Because if we don't, then the results will not be effective and optimized correctly.
Right.
So how does the success look like? I mean, what do we look at it? I mean, we have this very aggressive goal the Maersk has, which is very admirable, 2040, carbon neutral. It seems that there is a tremendous momentum about ESG across different verticals, industries, countries. Everyone's aware of it. What does the success smell and look like?
Well, first of all, it starts from the top. So you've got to have that C-suite and the board buying into this and being consistent with this messaging. And then you've got to actually break it down into the component parts. The ocean piece will do this, and here's how we're going to do that, and here are the intermediate goals. The warehouses, the trucks, each of those pieces, how are we going to do each of those parts, and how are we going to report it? So you've got to have actually all of the details, some of it engineering details, some of it more accounting detail, to be sure that you've got all of the pieces accounted for all along the pathway so that your trajectory ends up where you need to be.
Makes complete sense. So the success would have to be that we create KPIs, the key performance index, and set the target, and then measure against those targets and make sure that I'm sure we want to celebrate some successes and also pay attention to those that we don't hit the goals or the targets. Why not?
Exactly.
And how do we fix it?
And every February, the second week of February, we publish our annual sustainability report. And for each one of the ESG pillars, and I think we've got 13 or 14 different pillars defined where we actually set metrics. We report on why this is important to community, to the society, why it's important to us as a company, what were our goals, how did we do, and what are we going to do next? And so we do that for each of those in our say, 50-page sustainability report every year and try to make and we post it right on our website.
Fantastic.
So, and more companies are doing impact reports or sustainability disclosures. We're now starting to see movements in the EU and here in the US. The SEC has proposed rules for companies being required to disclose certain SEC criteria, ESG criteria.
Makes sense, makes sense. Well, this is great insight. I think it really provides a very deeper perspective about the ESG, how each of the element works and how each of the element ties together. And of course, I can't wait to read your past February impact report and look forward to seeing next year's. But I know many of my students, they're aspiring citizens. They're passionate about Earth, environment, and some of the impact that previous generation has caused. And they are always looking at sustainability as their passion. What message would you have? There are two distinct messages that I would love for you to parlay here. One, as a successful women leader, what message those young aspiring women students, almost 55% of my student body is women. What message do you have as to how do they not only focus on areas of their passion, but be successful climbing the corporate ladder and be just a general message to anyone who's aspired, what they can do and how do they progress in this field?
Oh, that's a whole hour seminar right there. But, you know, supply chain in particular, as you pointed out in a program this morning, used to be the old white-haired guys' venue. You didn't see much diversity. There's a huge increase. If you just look at the speakers at our conference this week, there's a huge increase in women and other nationalities and other ethnicities all through the supply chain. We have to continue that progress. But we, as those who would fit that diversity and as women in business, have to keep the standards up. We have to continue to support each other. We have to continue to say, yes, I'll take on that project, be bold, but without being too pushy. And finding that balance is a trick for each woman. But take on those projects that might require you to stretch a bit, but request feedback. When you take on that project, you have to say, I'll do that on the condition that you will provide me feedback on how I'm doing and how I'm doing it at these intervals. Because that's something that often men get, but that more diverse candidates, and particularly women, are less likely to get from their leadership. And it's a leadership skill that we also need to teach, is to be sure that we are providing the same quality of feedback to all of our
all
candidates,
genders, yeah.
to all genders. So I would say that I hope there's a learning in there somewhere.
No, absolutely. That's a great insight. That is to rise to the challenge, ask for it, and then also seek the feedback. I think that's a brilliant feedback. What's the general sense to our, you saw we have an aspiring cohort 11 of 130 plus students. Mm-hmm. Many of them probably are aspiring to have further conversation on the ESG, studying further into the sustainability. We have several classes that touches this subject. We are creating a new elective network design that will actually talk about circularity and actually understanding from the design standpoint, how do we build the sustainable products going forward?
You know, I'm really excited to hear that you're actually incorporating that into the mainstream of what you're teaching. Because for so many years, sustainability was this separate little course that you had to take, or it was probably called something else at that point, you know, all other, and it got combined with some things. I would have to say that for the students, you don't have to be in the sustainability department to make a big difference in sustainability. As a matter of fact, people in product development, in operations design, that network design concept, we've got whole groups of people that work on solutions for customers. How do we get this from this part of the world to that part of the world with the lowest impact, the greatest reliability, the best cost, and so forth? How do we combine and optimize all of those pieces? People doing those functions can probably have a bigger impact on the business than people on my team who are actually giving them data on carbon footprint, because they are actually creating it.
Once again, thanks for joining today's episode on ESG, environment, social, and governance. It was such a brilliant topic that really matters and touches every single lives, not here at home, but globally. Every country, every community, we're faced with some of the important questions of our life. And I'm glad that we had a chance to talk about ESG at a somewhat broader level. I look forward to having a further conversation on this subject sometime in the near future. But until then, thank you and fight on.
We hope you enjoyed another exciting episode of Supply Chain Demystified. Stay tuned for the next demystifying discussion on the supply chain. Visit uscsupplychain.com to stay up to date on all things supply chain.